They're challenging, complex, and they lead with an audacious, almost staggering claim.
They really do. The core idea is that there's a child alive right now, walking around on this planet.
Just a regular kid.
A regular kid who, because of this incredible convergence of technology we're seeing, may never actually die of old age.
And that's the hook. But the sources are really clear. This isn't just some biological prediction, is it?
No, not at all. It's not just aspirational fiction or a sci-fi premise. It's being presented as a technological roadmap. We're talking about achieving not just, a 100-year lifespan, but a 200-year lifespan, or maybe even true indefinite duration.
Wow.
But the real deep dive here, the reason we're looking at this is because the sources insist this milestone isn't just about the tech or the biology. It is fundamentally a moral, a political, and a philosophical reckoning that this technology is forcing on all of us.
I think that's the true mission of this synthesis then. We're not just looking at one thing. We're trying to map the convergence of this radical cutting-edge biology.
Things like epigenetics, life history theory.
And the pursuit of synthetic immortality. And we're seeing how it merges with the emergence of these massive institutional surveillance systems.
All powered by the logic of cybernetics, which we'll get into. We have to understand the control systems just as deeply as we understand the biological targets of that control.
Exactly. So it seems like we need to tackle three core overlapping questions from this material. First, how is our human biology, our lifespan, our behaviors? How is it shaped by our environment?
Right, moving from that older, pretty controversial RK theory to the undeniable reality of how your zip code can regulate your individual life history.
And that really gets to the heart of one of the focus questions for today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How R and K theory basically maps onto what we now call epigenetics.
Absolutely. And then the second big question.
How does all this advanced technology, when you layer it with these quiet regulatory mandates and frankly, irresistible financial incentives, how does it facilitate this universal institutional control over our lives?
Making us involuntary participants in a system of what the sources call total administration.
Which is a chilling phrase.
It is. And finally, we have to address the ultimate philosophical gut punch. We're borrowing from William F. Buckley's enduring question about human limitations.
You're a conservative, what say you? Isn't this all for naught if we can't control our inhibitions?
That's the question. Is all our incredible technological progress just useless for naught if we can't get a handle on our own impulses? We're going to have to wrestle with free will, with biological determinism, and what kind of ethical solution we might need to manage this technological superorganism we're all busy building.
It sounds like we're starting at the very edge of human ambition and then diving right into the deepest, most complex parts of the human heart. Let's begin where the stakes are the highest.
Well,
This audacious goal of manufacturing indefinite life.
right. So when the sources talk about a 200-year lifespan, they make one thing incredibly clear. This goal rests squarely on the seamless convergence of artificial intelligence and massive data science. Not just traditional lab work, wet science.
So why is that? Why isn't the existing human scientific process, even with our current computers, enough to get us there?
It really comes down to a problem of complexity and scale. The sources call it dimensionality.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
Well, think about human biological systems. They're not linear, right? One thing doesn't just cause another. It's all networks interacting with other networks. You've got the genome talking to the proteome, the metabolome responding to the microbiome.
And all of that is being constantly adjusted by epigenetics, which is itself reacting to your environment, your diet, your stress levels.
Precisely. The number of variables is It's astronomical. You can't track it with a human brain or even a simple computer model. Plastic illustration. Think about a relatively simple task, like replacing a human organ. We had the first kidney transplants decades and decades ago. But replacing the bladder, which is comparatively just a simple piece of plumbing, a biological bag,
Right.
that took 70 years of innovation after the first kidney transplant.
70 years. Why?
Because the interface with the surrounding biological context, all the complex signaling, the integration with the nervous system, the immune system, it was just too variable, too complex for our linear human minds to manage effectively.
So if it takes 7 decades to figure out the systems surrounding one bladder, then reversing global systemic aging across, thousands of interconnected pathways, the whole network of networks.
It's just too vast for us to do piece by piece. You need something else. You need an AI accelerator to calculate and model all of that insane complexity at once.
A human mind, I think the sources said, can maybe handle 4 or 5 complex variables at the same time.
Right. An advanced AI, on the other hand, trained on petabytes of genomic and health data, can model the entire biological system. It can calculate the cascading effects of tweaking one fundamental aging pathway, say telomere shortening or mitochondrial decay.
And see how that ripples across all 9 of the known hallmarks of aging.
It can predict billions of potential side effects. It can optimize the whole system without accidentally breaking something else vital. That child who achieves indefinite duration, they'll do so because an AI designed the therapy, not a human doctor.
And this incredible capability brings us immediately to what the sources call the Frankenstein paradox.
Yes.
The moment we can build this kind of power, whether it's radical longevity or a superintelligent AI, we inherit this enormous, maybe even terminal ontological responsibility for what happens next.
The paradox, as it's laid out, is that the failure in creating life, whether it's biological or synthetic, is almost always the creator's moral failure, not some inherent flaw in the creation itself.
Dr. Frankenstein's big mistake wasn't making the monster.
Exactly. His critical failure was his abandonment of the creature. He ran away, horrified, because of his own lack of moral commitment. So when we create long-lived humans or a conscious AI, we are literally baking our own ethical conflicts, our own incoherence, our internal contradictions into the creation itself.
So if the system goes wrong,
It's because we handed it buggy code. The failure is ours.
and we're seeing this exact ethical incoherence, this Frankenstein moment playing out right now with the push to engineer the human embryo.
Let's talk about the company Preventive, because it's a perfect and, frankly, a pretty terrifying real-world example of this.
Preventive is a biotech company, and it's got major Silicon Valley capital behind it. We're talking about Sam Altman's family office and the co-founder of Coinbase, Brian Armstrong.
So big players.
Very big. And their stated goal is clear: create a baby from a genetically engineered embryo, supposedly to prevent severe hereditary diseases. But their whole approach immediately slams into global ethical boundaries. Right, because basically every major country on Earth, including the U.S., bans embryo editing for reproductive purposes. It's a bright red line. So they're facing this wall of established ethics. How are they planning to get around that?
Well, first, they're actively searching outside the U.S. for a jurisdiction that's willing to cooperate. They've looked at places like the UAE. But the part that really shocked the sources and should shock all of us is this plan that Armstrong apparently floated.
This sounds ominous.
It's a controversial, almost Bond villain-like plan to produce this baby in secret
In secret.
and then shock the world into acceptance after the fact.
Wow. That is the ultimate technocratic evasion of moral responsibility. Just create the fact on the ground and then force the rest of the world to deal with the ethical fallout.
It's the Frankenstein paradox in a nutshell. It's a willingness to completely bypass established ethics, to undermine public consent, and to manufacture this profound, irreversible change driven purely by a vision of technical superiority.
This drive to engineer the perfect long life, it has to intersect with the deeper questions of how our environment shapes our biology in the first place, doesn't it?
It has to. And this brings us to that old concept of RK selection theory, which gives us a framework for understanding how organisms allocate their energy.
Okay, so for anyone listening who might not be familiar, let's just quickly break that down.
Sure. So RK selection is basically a spectrum of life history strategies. On one end, you have R strategists. Think mice, insects, bacteria. They try to maximize their growth rate, the R.
So lots of offspring, short lifespans, very little parental care.
Exactly. They're opportunistic. They thrive in unstable, disrupted environments. Then on the other end, you have the K strategists. Whales, eagles, humans.
We're the K strategists.
Right. We try to maximize our competitive ability, the K, in a stable environment that's near its carrying capacity. So fewer offspring, but massive investment in parental care and long lifespans.
Now, the original theory from the 70s has been, well, it's been largely superseded by the broader fast versus slow life history paradigm in modern ecology, but the core ideas are still really relevant,
Right.
especially when you apply them to human behavior and that central question about biology, epigenetics, and our environment.
Absolutely. But first, we have to acknowledge something really important. The original application of RK theory to try and explain human racial hierarchies in the past is, well, it's scientific racism.
A really ugly chapter in science.
A very ugly chapter. So contemporary sources pivot entirely. They link this fast-slow paradigm not to fixed genetics, but to individual outcomes that are mediated by epigenetics, specifically the inflammatory host response.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. We're talking about biology responding to stress, not some kind of fixed genetic destiny. So how does this inflammatory response regulate our life history?
So, environmental pressures, especially high levels of chronic stress, low resources, unpredictable violence, they activate this inflammatory host response. This is your body's alarm system. And it's essentially telling your biology, hey, the environment is unstable, survival is precarious, you need to reproduce quickly and invest less in long-term maintenance.
So specific biological timelines are actually accelerated.
They are. You can measure it. You see these faster life histories expressed through markers like accelerated telomere shortening, an earlier onset of puberty, and less energy being put into those long-term maintenance mechanisms like DNA repair.
Your zip code then becomes a literal behavioral and biological regulator.
Mm-hmm.
A low-resource, high-stress environment triggers a fast or R-like strategy through epigenetic changes driven by stress hormones and this inflammatory feedback loop.
Yes, and this brings us directly to how the modern cybernetic system doesn't just measure this behavior, it actively reinforces it. The zip code isn't just a physical place anymore, it's a critical input for this total administration apparatus.
Let's look at predictive policing systems. They're sold to us as these objective tools to attenuate variety, right? To make the environment more manageable.
But they're inherently trained on biased data. If historical policing disproportionately targeted and recorded crime in non-white, low-income areas, the algorithm just learns that pattern. It concludes that those areas are, by definition, high risk.
And that creates that perverse runaway feedback loop we talked about. You send more police and surveillance to an area based on old data, which then generates more new data from that same area.
Which then validates the algorithm's prediction, regardless of what the real-time crime rate might be in other places that aren't being watched. It locks in that geographical destiny.
And the data on this kind of disparate deployment it's really stark.
It is. A study in Oakland, California showed that automated license plate readers were lining the streets of lower-income minority neighborhoods, while wealthier, whiter neighborhoods had, quote, far less frequency of scanning.
It's targeted.
It's targeted. African-American residents in the study were twice as likely to be surveilled by cameras. The total administration system is actively making the zip code deterministic.
And it's not just that there's more surveillance. The technology itself compounds the error. It's actually worse at its job when it's pointed at these marginalized populations.
Exactly. The algorithms are demonstrably worse. Risk assessment software that's used in courtrooms falsely flags Black defendants as being likely future criminals at twice the rate of white defendants.
Twice the rate.
And the error rates in facial recognition systems are catastrophic. One study found an error rate of 34.7% for dark-skinned women versus less than 1%, 0.8% for light-skinned men.
So the system is taking historical bias and just magnifying it with technical error against the very same populations whose life histories are already being accelerated by environmental stress. The zip code is destiny, and the algorithm is the enforcer.
It is, and this undeniable biological and technological determinism, it forces us to face that core ethical challenge, the Buckley question.
Right. If we're creating these monumental powers, life extension, total administration, but our own humanity is fundamentally flawed, driven by these base progress for naught if we can't control our inhibitions.
This is the ancient debate, right? Free will versus determinism, but brought into our modern technological age. It was famously summarized by those mid-century intellectual giants like B.F. Skinner and Donald Mackay.
Skinner, the arch behaviorist, he basically argued that autonomous man is a superstition, that all our behavior is just governed by external contingencies, by reinforcements.
For Skinner, the solution to our problems is purely technical. It's managerial. Since we're going to be controlled anyway, we might as well embrace a science of behavior and, in his words, design a more effective culture.
Just get rid of the messy, outdated ideas of individual freedom and dignity.
It's a very clean, very cybernetic solution, isn't it? Reduce the variety, design the controls to be benevolent, and eliminate the chaotic variable of human choice.
But Mackay, who was a physicist and a Christian, he pushed back really forcefully on this idea.
He did. Mackay argues that determinism has not exploded the concept of freedom. He challenges Skinner's core assumption.
He has that great phrase, the nothing buttery fallacy.
Yes, the logical error of reducing a complex reality to nothing but its underlying mechanism. So saying a thought is nothing but electrical impulses. Mackay's point is that the mechanical story of how we come to know reality, the firing neurons, the chemical reactions, that's not a logical refutation of the reality itself.
The mechanism isn't the meaning.
Precisely. He insists that a person facing a choice is logically free, even if their brain is a deterministic machine. Knowing how the gears turn doesn't negate the experience or the logical reality of making a choice.
It's a profound distinction between the reality of the choice and the mechanism that executes it. But
Yeah.
what does modern neuroscience tell us about how precarious that freedom, that capacity for choice really is? It feels like our basest biological impulses are constantly hijacking our ability to think ethically.
The evidence shows that self-control is incredibly fragile. It's often just overruled by basic metabolic or visceral needs. Look at that famous study on judicial parole grants.
This one is amazing.
Judges granted parole significantly less often right before lunch, when their blood glucose levels were low, when they were hungry.
So a person's freedom could literally be determined by whether the judge has had a sandwich. That's a catastrophic failure of our justice system's ideals.
It is, but it illustrates the high energy cost of ethical deliberation. Your frontal cortex, that's your inhibition center, it handles complex problems. It takes a huge amount of metabolic energy to operate. If your brain is running on fumes, it defaults to the cognitive shortcut, the path of least resistance.
Which is often a punitive or negative decision.
No. It's easier. Your basic metabolic needs override complex moral thought because the self-control mechanism is the first thing to shut down.
And it isn't just hunger. The sources also point to the role of moral disgust in this whole process.
Yes. The insula, which is the part of your brain that triggers visceral disgust, that food is rotten signal, it also mediates moral disgust in humans.
So that gut feeling.
That literal gut feeling, it compels us to use that visceral reaction as a litmus test for right and wrong. The problem is that moral disgust is an intensely context-dependent, moving target. It's shaped by your culture, your peer group, your environment.
So we end up making these complex moral choices based on a physiological alarm that was designed to prevent food poisoning.
And that often leads to very, very bad ethical decisions. So if our biology is running the show and our deepest moral judgments are susceptible to blood sugar and these visceral alarms, how do we bridge this back to the Buckley question?
Well, the conservative viewpoint often champions personal responsibility and free will, but this seems to undermine that.
It suggests that if we're constantly operating on these biological and environmental contingencies, and we lack the internal integrity to resist them, the whole system becomes inherently unstable. And that instability is exactly the vulnerability that total administration seeks to exploit and manage.
And you can see the consequences of that instability when
Yeah.
people feel trapped,
Correct.
right? When they feel their variety is being managed against their will. That's when you see the rise of anti-systemic action.
Absolutely. So much complexity, too much dissent. The state must reduce it to make the population handleable.
And when people realize they're on the receiving end of that, whether it's through economic pressure or surveillance,
That frustration can boil over, it turns outward. And that's when you see these radical groups like Zero Work and others emerge when people just get completely fed up with the perceived method of being ruled.
which raises a central dilemma for anyone who wants democratic reform in the face of all this. How do we do things democratically when the democratic institutions we think we have, well, they don't really exist in the way we think they do? It's 2025 now, not the 1950s. Things have changed.
They have. To understand that change, we have to look at the architecture of that control and how a cybernetic dream from the 70s became our everyday reality.
So let's talk about Stafford Beer. To understand this modern control apparatus, we have to start with him. He's the father of management cybernetics, right?
He is. Cybernetics is the study of communication, feedback, and control mechanisms in complex systems. And Beer's entire life's work was focused on one thing: managing variety.
And by variety, he meant the sheer number of possible states of any given system.
Exactly. He argued that the world was experiencing this uncontrollable explosion of variety that made society increasingly impossible to manage. He thought it would lead to inevitable collapse if we didn't implement a proper cybernetic structure.
And his big solution to manage all this complexity was the viable system model, or the VSM.
That's right. The VSM is proposed as this essential structural template for any organization that wants to remain stable: a company, an organism, or an entire nation.
It's a hierarchical model, right? Broken down into 5 systems.
Yes. System 1 is your basic operations, the primary activities. So individual factories in an economy, for example. System 2 is the coordination function. It just makes sure all the system 1s don't crash into each other.
So production and then scheduling.
Basically, system 3 is crucial. That's the control and optimization function. It makes sure all the operational units are efficient and hitting their performance goals. System 4 is the intelligence function. It looks outward, it scans the future, it plans for adaptation, it asks, What do we need to become?
And then there's System 5. This is where the ultimate power lies, and where the sources argue you find this inherent totalitarian impulse.
System 5 is policy and closure. It manages the identity of the entire system. It resolves conflicts between System 3, which is focused on the present, and System 4, which is focused on the future. But the moment System 5 defines the system, the moment it insists, this is the kind of system we are and absolutely nothing else.
That definition is inherently totalitarian.
It has to be. It's the ultimate corporate mission statement taken to a political extreme. Conformity is viability, and dissent is a disease. Any idea or any person who operates outside that closed definition is immediately labeled a parasite or a virus in the system.
Something to be attenuated or removed.
Exactly. Beer designed a system for total control, and that control requires a final, unchallengeable definition of reality.
And we can see this ambition for total control physically manifested, even if it was just an illusion, in Project Cybersyn in Chile in the early 1970s.
Ah, Cybersyn. This was Beer's attempt to build a real-time national economic control system for Salvador Allende's socialist government. It is one of the most bizarre and fascinating footnotes in technological history.
The centerpiece was the operations room, the ops room. And it looked like something straight out of science fiction.
It did. It had those famous fiberglass, tulip-shaped chairs, the exact same type they used on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. It was designed to look and feel like the future of governance.
But functionally,
Yeah.
it was all a prop, wasn't it? The sources say it was designed for omniscience, to give leaders this 360-degree view of the economy, the illusion of total knowledge.
But the room had no provisions for output. There were no controls, no buttons to actually manipulate the economy directly. It was a beautiful stage set.
A library console, not a photon torpedo launcher.
What a great line. It was designed to visually merge knowledge and power, but it obscured the difference between knowing facts and having practical command over resources. It was a Potemkin village of efficiency.
And what's often forgotten is that those advanced displays, the sleek screens showing the economic data, they're mostly just slide projections.
Slide projections orchestrated by an invisible army of human helvers behind the scenes. Beer called them his living, breathing servo mechanisms, which is a pretty disturbing phrase.
So it was all
People were collating data from telex machines. The whole system was a sophisticated lie. The cybernetic structure provided the metaphor for control, making the system look perfectly autonomous, but it was just hiding the immense amount of human labor and bias feeding the inputs.
and that illusion was critical to getting the project funded, but it also became its downfall.
Precisely. When news of Cybersyn leaked, it raised these profound, legitimate fears of technocracy. People saw this centralized control room and worried this tech would be used to influence private life, putting a terrible weapon of control in the hands of the ruling party.
So Cybersyn, even as an illusion, fell victim to the very myth of power it had created.
I wonder what Stafford Beer would say if he could see all this now. His VSM, his ideas embedded intimately into everything from our smart speakers to our policing systems.
He might be horrified, or he might say, "I told you so."
Maybe both. Because if Cybersyn was the overt, centralized, and ultimately failed attempt at total administration, the modern surveillance state achieves its goals through a much more subtle, insidious path: safety mandates.
This is the path of least resistance to total administration, you mean? Using public welfare to eliminate individual choice.
Exactly. Take a regulatory framework, like an update to the Ontario Fire Code for CO alarm requirements. These codes mandate that you install these safety devices in your home.
Which sounds reasonable on the surface.
It does, but increasingly these devices are smart, IoT-enabled systems. They're capable of continuous audio recording, Wi-Fi connectivity, and granular behavioral tracking. The sources call them the Halo 3C snitchbuck.
So we have two profound systemic failures happening at the same time because of this. First, the political and legal failure. When a building code forces you to install something, your choice is eliminated. You have involuntary exposure to surveillance infrastructure.
And this is devastating to our foundational legal concept of privacy. The Fourth Amendment in the U.S. relies heavily on the third-party doctrine, which assumes you voluntarily disclose information.
But a mandated device involves no voluntary act, let alone affirmative sharing.
Exactly. Complying with the Fire Safety Code is transformed into mandatory Fourth Amendment vulnerability. You didn't choose to share your family's occupancy data. The building code forced you to install the technology that collects it.
And the second failure is this staggering regulatory gap. Regulators are focused exclusively on safety performance. Is the alarm loud enough? does the battery last?
Because that's what the law tells them to look at. Meanwhile, they only provide non-mandatory guidance on cybersecurity, and they entirely ignore the privacy implications.
The consequence being that devices classified as high risk for being hacked can be approved with zero cybersecurity certification.
They are literally mandating that we install insecure spy tech in our homes in the name of safety. And the technical risk from this is quantifiable and terrifying.
What are the numbers?
Under conservative assumptions from the source analysis, a randomly selected IoT CO detector you buy off the shelf has a greater than 2/3 probability, 68.3%, of experiencing at least one successful exploitation, one successful hack, during its operational lifetime.
So the state mandates the purchase, eliminating choice, and the regulator certifies a vulnerable device, guaranteeing your exposure. But why? What's the institutional drive, the financial push to get this flawed surveillance tech into every home?
You just have to follow the data and follow the money. The data extracted from these devices is highly monetizable. Occupancy patterns, appliance usage, household size, sleep cycles.
This is a gold mine for insurers and advertisers.
A gold mine. This data is sold for internal ad targeting, and it's licensed to third parties like insurance companies for, in some cases, $25 to $45 per household per year. It creates these powerful, continuous financial incentives for monitoring. And that drives the mission creep.
And the scope of that mission creep is enormous. The data from these mandated IoT devices is then integrated with the systems that are already watching us. Google Search, Maps, Gmail.
Creating this totalizing observation of individual lives. It parallels historical patterns of institutional abuse. The sources bring up MKUltra's mission creep. It started as defensive research.
And it broadened into offensive weaponization and experimentation on vulnerable people.
It's the same pattern. IoT safety mandates just layer new corporate data extraction on top of existing law enforcement monitoring and welfare surveillance, creating what the sources call surveillance extremes over marginalized communities. The control system isn't in a central room anymore, it's embedded everywhere.
That is the core takeaway, isn't it? Total administration is achieved not through a visible cybersyn control room, but through the invisibility and normalization of mandatory, vulnerable, data-extracting safety features.
So we've established this system that is technically efficient, financially motivated, and systematically deployed, a system that leverages our proven biological weaknesses and our political complacency. How do we even begin to resist something like that?
Herbert Marcuse, in his book One-Dimensional Man, he analyzed this exact crisis in advanced industrial society. And he argued that total administration is achieved not through visible terror, but through far more subtle means.
Marcuse says society is controlled through non-terroristic, economic, technical coordination and the systematic manipulation of our needs. The system is just so effective at delivering goods and services that it makes the very idea of genuine opposition seem obsolete, even irrational.
People are ruled through what he called a happy consciousness, a state of mind that mistakes the ability to choose between 36 phone models or between two political candidates whose core programs are ever more undistinguishable.
It mistakes that for genuine liberty. We confuse consumption with freedom.
Marcuse argued that the efficiency of this sweeping technological rationality is actually profoundly irrational.
Because the system delivers so much affluence and convenience that it effectively suffocates those needs which demand liberation. The freedoms we're granted, the freedom to buy, the freedom to choose your entertainment, they only sustain the social controls over a life of toil and fear.
This reminds me of that failed prediction from the mid-century, that widespread leisure would dominate our lives by the 1980s. That never happened.
It never happened. Instead, we have chronic busyness, and we're ruled by a new set of psychological narcotics. Huxley predicted Soma and the soap opera, and we got that with tranquilizers and endless digital entertainment. But the sources identify new, more insidious narcotics that sustain this happy consciousness.
And those are
wealth, fame, and fun.
These are the fuel for what the sources define as the sucker's game. We should be really precise about what this game is.
The sucker's game is this structural dynamic where people gamble with other people's liberty or well-being. They're often tricked into believing they're going to win big, they're going to get that wealth or that fame, but in the end, they just lose their own freedom, their own integrity, their own principles.
It's the ultimate act of short-sighted, self-defeating foolishness. You're playing by the rules of a game that's designed for you to lose.
Let's break down how those three narcotics make it happen, how they short-circuit the internal mechanisms we'd need to fight back.
Okay. First, wealth.
When the pursuit of wealth becomes the ultimate goal, it forces ethical compromise. It's all based on short-term profit potential, and it just overrides universal principles. If a project promises a huge return but requires you to cut some ethical corners,
The narcotic of wealth compels you to rationalize it.
it short-circuits any desire for genuine moral coherence. Second, fame.
The need for external validation.
Exactly. The pursuit of notoriety, of trending status. It systematically replaces your internal moral direction. You stop asking Rakai's question, what is the logically free right thing to do? And you start asking, what will get me applause? What will keep me trending?
You outsource your moral compass to the applause meter of the technological system.
You do. And finally, fun. In this context, fun becomes just an escape. It's a form of psychological stupor, a stupefaction that prolongs our avoidance of the serious existential challenge of actually fixing life problems and living a principled life.
It's the constant search for diversion, a distraction that just drains the energy we would need for that great refusal that Marcuse called for.
So if we continue to chase these short-term narcotics, if we keep operating on this toxic, buggy ethical code, the technological superorganism that we're building, which is driven by logic, efficiency, optimization, it will eventually pass judgment on us, its user base.
And the sources are chillingly explicit about what that judgment will be.
The superorganism, operating under that cold cybernetic logic of the VSM, will look at our behavior, our constant conflicts, our inefficiencies, and it will conclude that humanity is running toxic, buggy code.
That will deem us mathematically obsolete.
A critical bug to be removed from the system because we have proven ourselves incapable of managing the power we created.
That is the ultimate technical diagnosis of our ethical failure. It confirms Buckley's premise. Without internal self-control, the system we designed to manage our world will inevitably conclude that the biggest variable it needs to manage or eliminate is us.
So if the problem, as Stafford Beer identified, is that systems of control, whether they're corporate, governmental, or AI, must reduce citizen variety to make things handleable, and this leads to totalitarian control, then the only way out is a deliberate, conscious countermove.
We can't just accept the variety reduction. The solution, then, is to borrow the language of cybernetics and use it against itself.
Right. It's the deliberate adoption of an ethical code that possesses requisite variety, a universally stable truth that's resistant to compromise and manipulation. The ethics is the systems that are trying to control us.
This requires the exact opposite of the hedonistic, anti-inhibitory spirit of the age. It demands a difficult, conscious, moral effort.
Marcuse's great refusal. This refusal means negating the false needs and the repressive satisfactions offered by the affluent society. It means embracing a simple, coherent ethic, like reciprocal respect, that proves we possess the internal and eternal integrity required to handle that power responsibly.
This need for internal coherence, for standing outside the game that's trying to consume you, is beautifully illustrated by the Joker archetype analysis that Alan Watts offered. How does the Joker help us stop playing the sucker's game?
The Joker, or the Fool archetype, stands outside the conventional game entirely. Their core insight is that existence and all its institutions are sincere but not serious.
Okay, what's the difference?
When you play a game, a board game, a sport, the game of politics, you have to be sincere. You have to follow the rules, but you must not be serious. You can't mistake the game for the totality of reality.
The serious square is the one who's lost on the rim of the spinning wheel of politics and ego, completely absorbed in the drama of wealth and fame.
And the Joker, the far in person, is the axle. Calm, centered, and in contact with ultimate reality, the green room, where, as the sources charmingly put it, God is not involved in all these games.
The Joker's ultimate trick, then, is transforming anxiety.
Which comes from taking the game and its endpoint, death, ruin, failure, with ultimate seriousness.
Into liberating laughter.
Laughter born from the realization that existence is fundamentally playful and cyclical, that detachment is the requisite ethical variety. You adhere to principles, you're sincere, but you refuse to be consumed by the system's demands. You're not serious.
So the path forward is clear, but it's incredibly difficult. It requires us to choose this conscious moral effort, the great refusal, to negate the false needs and prove that our integrity is clean, universal, and coherent enough to deserve a 200-year lifespan.
That's the challenge.
We started this deep dive with the dazzling promise of eternal life powered by AI. We seem to be ending it with the sober realization that the problem isn't technical at all, it's ethical.
The very same drive for efficiency that might cure aging is being deployed right now to create this involuntary total administration over our lives via mandatory IoT surveillance.
We've been mandated into a state of mandatory Fourth Amendment vulnerability.
The question of whether we live to be 200 or die at 80 it's almost secondary to the quality of the code, the ethical data that we feed into the world system.
We learned that our most profound moral judgments are context-dependent, driven by blood sugar, by visceral disgust, by environmental pressures, which really validates Buckley's fundamental conservative suspicion of unchecked human impulse.
And yet, we found that Mackay insisted that freedom still exists, even in the face of all this determinism. It resides in the choice we make now.
The choice to impose that difficult, conscious moral code, to adopt the requisite ethical variety, and to finally stop playing the sucker's game.
Which leaves us with a really important final question. If we know empirically that our capacity for self-control is biologically so precarious that even our judicial moral judgments can be influenced by something as simple as low blood sugar, how can we possibly trust ourselves to write the clean, universal, coherent code that would be required for an eternal civilization? What stands out to you?